I welcome you all to our webinar series on Mahābhārata, initiated under the project Yoga Consciousness in Mahābhārata and Bhagavad Gita, the ethical value of societal and political well-being, which is taken up under the scheme for promotion of academic research and collaboration, Ministry of Education, Government of India. Our team includes Professor Vishwa Adluri, Professor of Philosophy, Hunter College, USA, and Dr. Joydeep Bagchi from Hindu University of America, USA, Dr. Gitesh Nirban from Kamala Nehru College, Delhi University, and me, Professor Bala, who is heading the Department of Philosophy at Delhi University presently. And we also have younger scholars supporting us, Ms. Jayashree and Ms. Anmol as research fellows of the project. Along with them, we have an extended team of Ms. Deepshika and Ms. Megha, who are supporting this webinar. As I have already mentioned, the theme of the project that we have taken up is Yoga Consciousness in Mahābhārata and Bhagavad Gita, the ethical value for societal and political well-being. This project aims to build a new approach to yoga that combines theoretical and practical perspectives, and it also helps us to understand yoga beyond a set of postures as an overarching term for salvic practices and to see how it is embedded in social and political reality. The project also aims to reappropriate the texts of classical Hinduism, which have suffered from Orientalist approaches, in order to articulate the vision of yoga consciousness. And we also aim to do in this project, demonstrate how answers to question of right action at societal and political levels can be explored through the conception of yoga consciousness in Mahābhārata and Bhagavad Gita that transcends sectarian and doctrinal boundaries to create a global system of thought and peace. So these are the basic objectives that we have with which we have began this project. And to be specific, there are certain pointers with which we would like to grapple with in this project. One of them being yoga consciousness in Mahābhārata, or specifically Bhagavad Gita. Along with that, we would also be dealing with in this project ethical values of societal well-being as it is articulated in the conception of Loka Sangraha in Bhagavad Gita. And we would also be dealing with ethical value of political well-being. So these were the central concerns of the project. And the specific question that we will be addressing is, what is the right course of action? And if at all there is a right course of action, how do we know that? That's a major obstacle, major concern for any kind of societal or political well-being that we would try to understand. And so far we had lectures on yoga consciousness, social well-being, political well-being, dharma and ethical dilemmas, etc. And now we have our distinguished speaker today, Professor Lakshmi Bandlamudi, who would be speaking on dialogic consciousness, answerability and dharmic validity, engaging with the Mahābhārata. As we understand, so basically, if people ask me like, how did you get introduced to Mahābhārata? I would say that it is my grandmother who has introduced me to Mahābhārata. No? Most of us would probably give the similar kind of answer. So how did we get introduced to this epic consciousness? It's already there at everybody's home in the form of the generations which have been transmitting it to each one of us. So if that is the case, the question that comes is, there is a distinction between monologue and dialogue. Is it that in the monologue form that you have got this, you got into the text, or you got into the text because of your dialogic nature? No? When I say monologue is very important to each one of us, and the text often we think that provides a monologue to us, but it's wrong as well. No? This monologue, though it is very important and it is required, it will not be convincing, because monologue will never address your doubts and inquiries that you have in your mind. You would be just trying to receive it, but you will not be able to engage with it, and also will not be able to resolve the doubts and concerns that you get in your brain. So that is how monologue is also a kind of limited kind of, it provides a kind of limited perspective where you will not be able to participate. And if there is no participation, obviously there is no clearing of your doubts. And that is how it is always limited in scope. But dialogue, that is how dialogue is required and dialogic consciousness is required, which helps us to move further and understand things in a better perspective. And that is where whenever we talk about, say for example, if I'm talking here, what is it that I'm trying to do? I'm trying to make sense of my presence here, you know, which at each point of instance of your life, what we try to do continuously is we try to make sense of our presence. And how do you make sense of your presence? Trying to derive meaning with the way you interact with the situation which is around you. So that is where, how do you make sense of your past? This is the question that most of the times people ask when it comes to the classical text that we have. Like, how do you make sense of your past or your classical text? That's what people ask. But my question is completely different. I would rather ask this in a different way, like how do you make sense of your present? When we try to answer this question, we try to make sense of our present through our lived experiences and also through our shared consciousness with the other people. And the third important one is our inherited culture. And when I say our inherited culture in the form of the tradition that we follow at home, or also it can also be the way the textual works were transmitted to us. So inheritance is in the form of the daily kind of things that we perform, and also in the form of a text. So what happens here is the meaning of a text or meaning of our own sensibilities. How does the meaning emerge at all? If at all we are talking about the text, the meaning emerges because of our present consciousness and also its dialogue with the past inherited consciousness. So that is where the dialogue comes. Like when I am trying to understand Mahabharata, I am using my present consciousness, which has come out of my lived experiences, and it is not stopping there. It's not a monologue there. It also takes into consideration the past inherited consciousness, and the dialogue between these two is the one which tries to provide us a sort of meaning. And the present consciousness that I have referred is time bound in the space and time categories of the present. But when it comes to the inherited consciousness, it seems to be going beyond the time. So that is how there is a continuous dialogue between time boundness and time transcending the time. So this dialogic one is the one which tries to provide a kind of dialogic space in the individual, which helps the individual to arrive at a particular sort of meaning. And that is how I think when we look at the classical Indian texts, probably that's the kind of dialogic one that we would be entering into. This basically hermeneutical exercise that we do, and I'm hoping that Professor Lakshmi would be addressing these and some more other issues which would be very interesting and valid to all of us. I welcome you, ma'am, for our webinar series. And now I request Dr. Geetesh to introduce Professor Lakshmi Bandlamudi. Over to you, Dr. Geetesh.
Thank you, Professor Bala. Good evening to all in India, and yes, a couple of our participants from US, good morning to you. And good morning to Dr. Lakshmi particularly. We are really honored to have you amongst us, and I take this opportunity to formally introduce you to our participants who are very regular with us for the last 16 weeks. So I would like to share with all of you that Dr. Lakshmi Bandlamudi is Professor of Psychology at LaGuardia Community College, City University of New York. She grew up in India and immigrated to US in 1981. She studied at Columbia University and Graduate Center, City University of New York, where she earned her master's and doctoral degrees respectively. She teaches courses in human development and women's studies. Dr. Lakshmi has published several papers in reputed journals and has presented papers at several international conferences in the areas connecting myths, culture, history, and consciousness. As far as her research work is concerned, it is grounded on the theoretical foundations of two Russian thinkers, the literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin and socio-historical epistemologist Lev Vygotsky. She has compared the works of Mikhail Bakhtin with those of Sanskrit grammarian and philosopher Bhartrhari, and with another philosopher of aesthetics from India, Abhinav Gupta. In all her varied works, her main focus and goal is to promote dialogic consciousness, and that's what Dr. Bala was just talking about. She has also published books titled Movements for the Cosmic Dancer on Pilgrimage to Kailash Mansarovar, which was published by MLBD in 2006. Dialogics of Self, the Mahābhārata and Culture, the History of Understanding and Understanding of History was published by Anthem Press in 2010. Her another work is Difference, Dialogue and Development, a Bakhtinian World, published by Routledge in 2015. Bakhtinian Explorations of Indian Culture, Pluralism, Dogma and Dialogue Through History, that had been published from Springer, New Delhi in 2018. She has received research grants, several of them, and has been the recipient of Fulbright Award thrice, in 1996 to Bulgaria and Romania, then in 2004 to China, and later in 2010 and 11 to India. In 2019 and 2020, she received BSc's SUNY Enhanced Research Award for conducting research at Banaras Hindu University, Varanasi, on India, as well as her works of Bhartrhari and Abhinav Gupta to prepare a manuscript, which is titled as Language, Reality and Laughter, Dialogues between Bhartrhari, Bakhtin and Abhinav Gupta. With this kind of work to her credit, we are really very honored to have a reputed scholar, Dr. Lakshmi, with us on Spark webinar platform. Today, as Dr. Bala just shared with all of us, she is delivering a very academically stimulating address on a topic of pertinence, and that is dialogic consciousness, answerability, and dharmic validity in engaging with the Mahābhārata. We are very happy to have you, ma'am, with us, and now I request you to take a on.
Thank you so very much for those very kind words. I'm not sure I even deserve it, but thanks a lot. It's really very kind of you. And it's truly an honor and a privilege to be addressing this very august audience. So let me begin the conversation. So many of the points that I wanted to kind of set the stage, Dr. Bala already set the stage for me in a very wonderful manner, in an eloquent manner, and that is about dialogic consciousness. So how did I get into this study? I'm not an Indologist, nor am I in the South Asian studies. However, my encounter with Mikhail Bakhtin in the mid-80s, when his works were being translated into English, and it was made available. So very early on, I practically grabbed onto that. Prior to Bakhtin, I was trained in Hegel and Kant and others. But somehow the moment I encountered the works of, because I'm a cognitive developmental psychologist, there was another Russian thinker that influenced me immensely, and that is Lev Vygotsky, and a semiotician from Tartu School, and that is Yuri Lotman. And so I got, as I said earlier, got mixed up. And Bhakti was one of the most transformative, moments in my academic life. And why was that so appealing? Because it was dialogic, meaning it was not one particular philosophy, one particular agenda, one theoretical problem or one philosophical problem, but rather clash between various philosophies. So when I read his work, my frame of reference invariably, became Mahābhārata. When I read the problems of Dostoevsky's poetics, I could not, I was reading Dostoevsky, but I was thinking Mahābhārata. There is no text that is so open-ended and so polyphonic and so multi-layered, so multi-dimensional. The other thing in the Western academic world is there is a very strict demarcation between the epic and the novel, because the novel is seen as the emblem of consciousness. And that, coming from the Mahābhārata culture, that seemed very odd, because the presence of the epic in the Indian setting is much more closer. It has a greater kind of a familiarity, very salience in the cultural life. As Dr. Bala said, I too learned Mahābhārata. Nobody sits and reads a text. So my grandmother would tell stories along feeding, food. So that's how we try to consume it. So it's the text is a living text. It is not a dead text as in the Western world. So when there is a living text, no living entity, be it a text or a human being, can be muted and be silent. You have to engage in a dialogue. And the other part, through how does this dialogue happen? And as Dr. Bala rightly pointed out, the intervention of the self is needed through our own lived experiences, located in the cultural space and time. We are encountering the text. So the time of the text and the time when it is read, interpreted, they kind of converge. So, so this is where the question of answerability comes from, and I'll elaborate on that. And secondly, dharma is very sukshma in Mahābhārata. In Ramayana, it is unwavering. God figure sets a good example. He adheres to dharma, no matter what, and you're supposed to follow it. Whereas in Mahābhārata is it came later and it is on a higher plane. See, first and foremost, Ramayana is kavya, so it is poetic consciousness. Whereas Mahābhārata is itihas, and it is bewildering complexities in the text. As I say, in this grand itihas, no individual, however noble their deeds might be, and no idea, despite its seeming idealism, is perfect and pure. So everybody is sort of seemingly on the surface very flawed, you could say, and resort to questionable tactics. Better whether it is in the battlefield or so. That's where the question of validity, ethical validity. It's not the absolute validity that matters, but it is the absolute ethics that matter. But rather, it doesn't even invite that kind. When you have absolute sense of dharma, right and wrong, and black and white, and things like that, the text doesn't yield to that kind of interpretation. So there is a certain variation, and so we need to understand that in order to make it applicable to the modern world and make sense of it, that intervention by the self is very much needed. So first and foremost, I want to say this is I see the Mahābhārata, like many people, as the flow. It is the Mahakal, the great time. The great time is a flowing river, however you want to call it. So you cannot arrest that at any time. Only thing, you enter that flow and see what kind of exchange is taking place, in the flow of time. That is very critical, and the support for that, theoretical support, both from Bhaktin or Lotman or even Bhartrhari, he would say the same thing, because he sees the time, Kala, Mahakal, as the kind of a flowing stream, and the historical time as a kind of a water wheel, that is sort of churning. And so there is a certain, so the Mahakal is responding to the historical time. It is, it's not sort of untouched by the history. So because it is a flow, and the text itself has a history. So the way I have, in many ways, because you pointed out about this is about yogic consciousness, and it reminds me of Sri Aurobindo. Basically, yoga, as you rightly pointed out, is not about body posture, but it is rather alignment of many factors, whether it is the temporality or whether it is the spatiality, or rather that connection, right, between the living text and a lived life, right? The text is a living entity. Life is, as you rightly pointed out, the present. And therefore, in our cultural genome, just as how the genome body has more than 30,000 genes from our ancestors, the cultural gene, the most prominent in the DNA of India, we could say, is really Mahābhārata and Ramayana too. Ramayana is more of an heteroglossic text, I would say. It has multiple layers, but it is poetic, meaning it has a beginning and an end. Many people do Ramayana Parayan. My mother does that. She can recite the entire Valmiki Ramayana, and during Ram Navami she would do that. But we do Gita Parayan, but no one does Mahābhārata Parayan. It just doesn't lend itself to that kind of poetic, and many writers in India have written about Ramayana to show their literary skills, their literary flourish. But Mahābhārata, I think only in Telugu we have Nannaya Tikkana and Erra Pragada, who have actually sort of written the text, over a period of time, but it doesn't have that kind of literary flourish. It doesn't, there are some segments that may have it, but because there's, so in other words, the dialogue itself, there is so much murkiness in this. So Sri Aurobindo would say Mahābhārata is a complete text, right? At the same time, paripurna. It seems to outmeasure space and outlast time, as Sri Aurobindo's in Aurobindo's words. But at the same time, it is a permanent construction site. We are all the time entering into the text, exploring new dimensions, some new ideas. Those things come from the present moment. What we are, our lived experience is sort of taking us back to Mahābhārata. It is not an idle excursion into the past, but rather multiple temporalities coexist. That is very unique to the Indian scenario. And I think we need to understand the uniqueness of temporalities in India, because our time stretches into the ancient past, and it has an immediate presence in the present moment, and it projects into the open-ended future too. Right? So because it is a flow of the river, it is picking up fragments from the various moments in history, and it even, as Bhartrhari would say, is preserving it in its at the bottom of the river, or in the depth of the rivers. And then there is a kind of an exchange that can take place. It displaces some old nuggets, into the banks at different places and different times, and at the same time absorbs it from the banks of the river so that means the text itself has a very, very long history. It has had a long life in time. So any text that has had such a long life in time is going to have incredible kind of semantic mobility. Because the Mahābhārata is a repository of ideas. It is a generator of ideas. It is a condenser of old ideas, or memories, right? And perhaps it's even a cleanser of unwanted ideas. So it does this sort of a multiple kind of function, and every engagement. and because it is an open-ended dialogue, the text itself is very dialogic to begin with. Even the structure of the text and the life of the text. For that matter, how does the Adi Parva begin? It begins with Ugrasrava narrating to the curious sages assembled in the Naimisha forest about what was heard, right? Forest, about how Vaishampayana narrated the epic text composed by Vyasa, in the snake sacrifice by Janamejaya. So that means already what is heard, right? Shruti, what is remembered. There is a transition between Shruti and Smriti. Yeah. That means there is a certain transitions and transformation. What is remembered is automatically not just simply you pluck it out of the memory storehouse. It undergoes transitions and transform. This Bhartrhari would attest to that because that is the very nature of time. That is so because what is stored in the memory is somewhat atemporal, and the moment it is dislodged, it becomes temporal. And once it becomes temporal, there is sequentiality and so on and so forth. So the text itself, the structure of the text itself is incredibly dialogic. What is remembered? So it doesn't go in a linear fashion at all. It is in a... but secondly, vast majority of the people, unless you're a Mahābhārata scholar, we are not exactly sitting and reading the book. You read you read Ramayana, but Mahābhārata is, you enter the text at any point and it is really captivating and it sucks you into that stream and you just have to sort of flow with the stream. So, but the other part is it invites every generation living within the confines of culture, facing the forces of history, to the semantic field or the semiotic field. Lotman gives this wonderful expression called the semiosphere. We need to enter that semiosphere to uncover, to activate dormant meanings. There are so many possibilities. The text is full of infinite possibilities, and because it is such an vibrant and it has an incredible semantic mobility, what is that semiotic field like? It is packed with uncertainties and ambiguities. That's where the Sukshma Dharma comes into the picture, because nobody is perfect. Everything is just so absolutely one need to, we wouldn't have a moral dilemma if the solutions were so easy. It is precisely because it is so difficult. We have to make some situational choices. That is where the ethical validity comes from. And I'll talk about more in the specific, So the act of reading, I would say, because I did not approach Mahābhārata as an Indologist, Vishwa Adluri does a fantastic job of that. So that's not my field. I don't know. But I am addressing it as an epistemological problem. How do we interpret? There is a broader problem of just interpretation. And interpreting the past, that is the an important issue, and specifically interpreting the text. So that very act of interpretation, what happens is there are multiple histories that are intersecting. What are those histories? It is the history of the text itself, right? Because it has had a very long life, and it has picked up many, no one can say that even when Suktankar and his team put together the critical edition, they make it very clear, trying to look for some authentic text is really a wild goose chase. It is not worth it, because the text has had a long life, just as how the individuals have had a long life. Our identity is formed by our participation in the cultural world. Similarly, the text also has developed a certain identity. For example, when Draupadi, Suktanka points out, when Draupadi sort of discredits the candidacy of Karna, during the Swayamvar, he says not all the versions have that plot. But nevertheless, this kind of creates a justification for why Karna later on in the Vastra Haran scene, he calls her Veshya. He was humiliated, and so he gets back. So there is some kind of an explanation, and that's what Suktankar said. Similarly, whether Draupadi laughed in the Maya Mahal scene is also very much questionable. Some versions say it was Bhim who laughed, and there are other versions that say that Draupadi laughed. Then he says we have to understand whether Draupadi had the temperament to laugh, and it clearly in any of the Telugu versions of Mahābhārata, that Draupadi's laughter is one of the scenes that have been so dramatized in practically from N.T. Rama to everyone. So that is just an integral part of it. And I think it varies from whether it is the Calcutta edition or the Kashmir edition or the Maharashtra edition. There are all kinds of, so the critical edition itself is a compilation of all these multiple versions, and there are internal discrepancies or variations, but that variation is the beauty. See, the very Mahābhārata itself, it is seen as, it was never meant to be this is the beginning and this is an end. One of the greatest challenges in presenting this work in the Western world is they cannot understand. What do you mean there's no beginning, there's no end? And I said, no, it is a very open-ended text. It is like a vriksha, that's what in the Mahābhārata it says. It is like a tree that keeps on growing, and it's almost like the banyan tree. It will have many other roots, right? The branches itself. So that is the very nature of it. So that means we need to engage with the text, not as a relic of the past or as a sort of a display item in a museum. That is not the way it is. There is no barrier. So what happens is, during that interpretive, and so what are the histories? I'm sorry. The histories are the history of the individual, in their engagement with the text. How did you remember? Even for the individual, there is the time of the story and the time of listening to that story. Multiple temporalities kind of. So what is what is your own history with the engagement with the text? There is the history of the text. There is the history of the culture. And more importantly, the very history of understanding. Because we do not just simply inherit the text. We don't listen. Our interpretive categories are also comes along with the text. How to make sense of it, right? The variations and the incredible. So I too, grandma would tell stories at night, and I grew up in Chennai, so you're gazing at the open sky, and you wonder what these characters, where they're roaming and what they're doing, and there is a certain wonderment to the and the moral dilemmas. So every point, whether it is Ramayana or Mahābhārata, they present you with moral dilemmas. My grandmother would ask, whose ethic was right? Was it Kumbhakarna who fought for Ravan, or was it Vibhishan who sort of went for Dharma and switched camps? So this is a very interesting. So very early on, we learn to deal with this complexities of Dharma. So during that interpretive moment or the encounter, the boundaries between here and now, and what lies beyond in time and space shift. And that is, so in other words, Mahābhārata participates in the intellectual galaxy, right, of its time. So this is what is sort of really very critical, and why the what is the concept of answerability? Answerability is, in the world of dialogue, right? In the world of dialogic consciousness, first and foremost, what allows for the dialogue? The very title I have given the book, Dialogics of Self, the Mahābhārata and Culture, means that it is not enough for the text to invite dialogue, invite you into the dialogue. You have to respond to that call. if you don't respond to that call, I don't think it has any effect. And Dr. Bala has pointed out about the monologue. See, the monologic consciousness is very fixed. So it does disservice to the text, because the text is a flowing river. It gushes out. It's like Ganga, you know, it just absolutely is gushing out. The force of it, if you have ever been to Gangotri, you can feel the force of Ganges. And similarly, the text itself is incredibly captivating, and it is packed with bewildering complexities. But for us to respond to the text, and we have to yield to that or respond to that invitation to a dialogue. It says, come, enter the world, enter the, swim in this river, or something like that. So dialogic consciousness is needed, the cultural conditions. I think today we live in really very dark times, where the monologic impulses have taken over, and dialogue has faced it becomes so rare. And that's why in my other book, that I have given the title Difference, Dialogue and Development. Unless the reality of differences necessitates a dialogue, and unless and until you actually respond to that dialogic call, there cannot be any growth, So dialogic consciousness is both the mediator for higher, modes, or the yogic or the integral yoga that Sri Aurobindo talks about, or, just regular development. So that kind of growth, right, that alignment occurs only when you engage in this kind of a dialogic process. Dialogue is not a transference of ideas from my mind to somebody else. It is not a conveyor belt, but rather there is a certain interpenetration of ideas. How does the lived life, because see, when you don't affix your signature in the interpretive process, you can do a whole lot of epistemic violence. Because it's a hands-off, you're claiming neutrality. You cannot claim neutrality when you're reading, for that matter, any text. So there is a certain, only when you take that accountability, right? When you say, okay, yeah, this is my lived experience. This is how I see the text. This is how we understand. It is not subjectivity. In the Indian traditions, we have something called as manodharma. When you're talking about, when you learn music, you have to sort of adhere to your manodharma too. So there are dharmas are so multiple, and so when you affix your signature, you are letting your voice, enter into the picture, and therefore you're taking responsibility for that interpretation. So there is a certain ethical stance. You can't say that, oh, this is what the text. Many of my subjects are talk about Mahābhārata as if it is, a relic of the past. It is a display item in the museum. And they want to know, those are the people who least engage with Mahābhārata, wants to know about the date and the authenticity, right? In other words, am I seeing the right artifacts in the museum? Is it a bogus one or is it a real one? Am I getting my money's worth? That sort of a thing. That's why Vishwa Adluri, I know him, he's from the same university, and I have enormous respect for his work. He says, don't ever bother about this idea of fixing the text in time and space. That would lead to what Nietzsche would call as the, Egyptian mummified consciousness. That is not what is required. You have to engage in a dialogue. The text is not a dead text. No, neither is the conscious can be a dead one. And therefore, that encounter is very much needed. So how does the concept of answerability facilitate the discovery of highly differentiated, provisional, and positional nature of ethical action? That is an important question. Grounded in the overarching framework of dialogism, Mikhail Bakhtin proposed answerability. What do we mean by answerability? It is the very essence of the dialogue between life and text. through my consciously lived life, and I'll give examples in a moment, through my consciously lived life, how do I make sense of the enormity of ethical dilemmas that the text is presenting us with, right? And that is a very important question, because art and Bhakti grounded this in the relationship between art and life. Art is not life and life is not art. Because art is grand. It has such lofty ideas. It is really, when we see Bharatanatyam or listen to a concert, it takes you to another world. But life is so prosaic. It is the prose, right? That is poetry and this is prose. But they have to meet at some point. And that meeting point, in other words, the art or even a text must answer to life. It cannot remain floating in the air and not necessarily make contact. Similarly, life cannot remain untouched by great texts and art. I cannot, make my life absolutely so, quotidian that I don't get, I remain untouched by the, So that means there has to be this exchange, and that exchange, interpenetrability, of interpenetration of ideas is the answerability. Right. So through that answerability, we are able to, so Bhakti knows that such a unity within the self guarantees metamorphosis, right? Co-authorship. Co-authorship is very important. One of the things with the epic text, and actually Vyasa himself, although he is literally and figuratively the father of Mahābhārata, he is setting up, that is the beautiful polyphony of complex kind of ethical dilemmas, ethical issues. Draupadi embodies the ethic of rage and retaliation, and Yudhishthir embodies the ethic of restraint and reconciliation. And they have heated, the best dialogue that you have between these multiple ethical standpoints is in Vanaparva, where she is using really very salty language. She calls him Napunshak. It was perfectly acceptable in that dialogue to actually have this clash. So what we witness in Mahābhārata is this sort of an incredible clash that is going on. So now I'll come to the actual example. How does life enter? The question of interpretation is not about, sometimes people ask me, those who interpret, perhaps they haven't read the text. And my argument is, the question is not about whether you read the text or not read the text, or whether you are a Mahābhārata scholar. Or ordinary people enter the text, they live with that. They go to the temples, they listen to, storytellers in whatever form it is, or even if it is Amar Chitra Kathas or Chandamama. I'm sorry, the person who is the illustrator of Chandamama died. I felt very bad because so many of us grew up reading Chandamama. That was the most endearing thing to do, right, as an Indian. So it gets... The other theoretical, let me just read to you some of a paragraph from my book. So the question that I'm asking is, how do individuals make sense of their personal and cultural past? How do they draw the range of possible meanings? In other words, when they hop onto that semiosphere, are they doing sufficient wandering, or are they just simply restricting themselves to a certain location? The questions are central to any discipline interested in consciousness, the history of consciousness, and consciousness about history. So sense making takes place in that semiotic field or that imaginative horizon where boundaries between here and there, and then and here and now and there and then are erased and redrawn. So the phrases like back then and back there are incredibly appealing. One romanticizes it or vilifies them. Very often, sometimes people, when they are not engaging in the dialogue, they will say all glorious things. Oh, only our Indian civilization would have, created an epic of this, magnanimity, and so on. So it's all the wonderful superlative adjectives. But in their engagement with the text, they are not showing the grandeur because they're just so monologic is the reading or their approach to words. So just simply empty words of the grandeur and the enormity, 7 times the size of Iliad and Odyssey, blah, blah, blah. These things have no meaning unless you actually engage with the text and wrestle with the dilemmas over there. It involves opening up the vivid moments of human experience, carefully stored in the interiors of the self. The interiors of what I see entering Mahābhārata itself as entering into a hall of mirrors. Right? You see yourself, seeing yourself, the images are infinite, and it is bewildering. So whatever is the closest image that you get, you think, but that is a reality. It is an epistemological reality. You cannot transcend that. So there will always be that, the closest image of the text and the self that you receive is where the real activity is taking place. So, that is where the answerability comes from. So the dialogic see, actually, Suktankar also says there are 4 levels in which we approach Mahābhārata in his, classic work. So he says the beginning is just simply the facts of the story. And then there is the sort of a moral, ethical, which is the dharma is very fixed, the right and wrong. But it has to go sort of beyond that. He says it is a philosophy of self. So that it is a philosophy of self, both the small s and the capital S. The small s and both are equally important. They need to coexist. That is what the yogic consciousness is all about. If you want to understand Mahābhārata, we need to sort of see. So when you enter the hall of mirrors, you also see the finite image of yourself in the infinite images too. It extends. You can't count it anyway. So that's the reason that this small self must enter the larger, in the mirror, and then to sort of express. The body is an infinite entity, but our inner consciousness is infinite. Right? I mean, we can have a dialogue on that. Body is a finite entity, but the inner consciousness, that's why Abhinav says you have to see the mirror, because with Bimb and Pratibimb, you have to see it through the mirror of Shiva, because that is how you sort of reach that higher levels or the vastness that Kashmir Saivism, talks about. Otherwise, it will be very limited. So the dialogic relationship between self-reflection and the text. See, Bakhtin was also equally interested. He was really a philosophical anthropologist at heart. He was trying to understand the interconnections between self, text, and culture. That was his main goal. And so that's why, because of his, I convened a Bakhtin conference in India to initiate, it was in 2013, and to initiate Bakhtin studies, because I feel that without compromising on the cultural ethos of India, Bakhtin has the explanatory capability. And he can enter into a dialogue, not necessarily as a mechanical import, from the West to the Indian scene, but without that, you're able to sort of, and I think that's where I think dialogicality and dialogic theory is very, very critical. Now let me talk about one of the other thinkers that have been, we search for analytical tools, in very, so unless having an interest alone is not enough. You have to have a very sharp analytical tools in order to make sense of this. So another Italian, somehow I'm very drawn to these old 300 years old or 600-year-old people. So somehow the ancient fascinates me. Yeah. So another thinker that became very, very critical in making my interpretations is the Giambattista Vico, an Italian thinker. And he talks about, because he traces the whole history. See, in many ways, someone like Hegel, did try to sort of engage with at least the Bhagavad Gita, and he was unable to squeeze the Mahābhārata into his sort of a linear trajectory, into that linearity of his philosophical thinking. And so he said India could only reach the level of imagination, but not the level of reasoning. So to him, the chaos of the Mahābhārata was just simply daunting, and he could not make sense. Or that theory, that philosophy does not make room for that. That kind of an epistemology just doesn't lend itself. So Mahābhārata doesn't lend it, it resists it, it rejects it. So it's impossible to handle. As Suktankar also would say, if you are going to have fixed categories of right and wrong, well, Mahābhārata constantly throws another. So every character in Mahābhārata is sort of, there is so much irony. I'll get to the irony in a moment. Vico talks about transitions. So he sees this, because I've already stated that Mahābhārata is like a flowing river. So that means we need to sort of have categories that is going to be moving, right? Not something that is static. So he talks about the movement of the tropes, rhetorical tropes, metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, and irony. So irony is what that he places. How does he do this? He says the transition from metaphor to metonymy is a theocratic world. So if you read Mahābhārata exclusively as a theocratic text, right? Krishna is the orchestrator of everything. Krishna is the savior. Sure, he is. But you have to read it on many planes, right? You have to read it both on the cosmic plane, on the governance plane, and on the individual plane, and the power relations, and so on and so forth. So the next transition from metonymy to synecdoche is the world of heroes. So heroes means, the world is structured along the lines of the powerful and the powerless. And I'll give you specific examples. So first, I just want to set the stage. And then the next one, the movement from synecdoche to irony, is where you are having, we enter the human world. The human world is incredibly complex. You cannot have it, even if you want to follow the ideals that you want to, you may not be able to live it. Because, Vico has a wonderful sentence. He says, even if you can't live up to your ideals, you must at least feel shame. You can't live up to the absolute ideals. None of the characters lived up to that absolute ideals. Why? Because the characters, the thing that brought glory to each of the characters, Bhishma Pitama is the vow that he takes, and Karna, the charitable nature, right? But the same qualities that brought them glory also was responsible for their downfall. So Bhishma Pitama got caught up because of his, so he had to rescue, guard Hastinapur at any cost, and he ended up fighting on the side of Adharma. But in a way, it had that kind of ethical validity because already the damage was done. right? And therefore he had to bring the disruption from within. In a crazy way, even Mama Shakuni wanted the collapse of Kuru dynasty. And he uses his very devious methods to bring about that kind of a destruction, right? Enemies come in many forms. Some enemies are, very direct, and some enemies are very sly and calculating, and so that is Shakuni. Yeah. So how do we sort of, so the Vico's characterization and the analytical categories serves us very well in sort of measure. See, we cannot talk about dialogue and not have the categories to capture that movement. So Vico's movement of the tropes, right, the tropology gives me the way to talk about how are these subjects moving from one to the other. So specifically, first I'll talk about one of the themes plots that I studied was Kunti going and revealing the secret of Karna's birth. Was her actions just a selfish woman who wanted to, Karna's character brings about many, many dilemmas. Why? First and foremost, the illegitimacy. That way, none of the Pandavas were born to the father who gave the cover, Panduraj. They were conceived by different gods, right? So whereas she gave birth to Karna before that, out of wedlock, it's a modern day problem too, out of wedlock. And then she abandoned him, and she watched him suffer all the humiliations. And at the time of war, just knowing fully well that he would never switch camps, right? Was she just simply interested? Was she the selfish, cruel mother who just wanted to, save her 5 Pandavas? It's a very interesting dilemma, right? Or is it that she had these maternal feelings and she felt the sorrow about abandoning Karna? But at the point, right before the war, when she is actually weakening his position, poor Karna took the blame from everybody. The mother abandoned, the guru cursed him, the Brahmin cursed him. I mean, and because he's of charitable nature, Indra came, and so you can make the statement that on the cosmic plane, Vishnu Bhagavan tried to save the Suryaputra in Ramayana, and in Mahābhārata he saved the Indraputra. So Vali and Sugriva, and so that is on the cosmic plane. But there is also the other planes of battlefield and so on. So you have to bring it to sort of many levels in this about a mother. What is the nature of motherhood? That itself is brought into question. Is she this absolute deified entity who can do no wrong? Or she is also at a human level sort of adhering to the social stigma and so on. But Mahābhārata itself has internal contradictions. The very father of Mahābhārata, Vyasa himself, is born out of wedlock to Satyavati. He doesn't experience the stigma. He doesn't face the stigma because she doesn't keep it a secret. Satyavati never kept it as a secret. In fact, she summons him to impregnate her widowed daughters-in-law. Whereas with Kunti, maintained a certain secrecy about it. But had she, so the question here is, was she just selfish? Or was it, is there unethical when she went to, and she was very clever too, even if you give her the doubt that she was, what can I say, that she had this kind of maternal feelings to go and reveal the secret. She was also very clever in going at the right moment. The time was very important, right? She goes in the early morning hours when he is doing the Surya Namaskar, Surya Puja, right? And that his vow is that time if anybody comes and asks him anything, he will give it away. So that was the time when Indra went and got his kavach and kundal. So when Kunti goes there, so the question here is, what is ethically valid? I would argue, and we can open it up for debate later on, I would argue that there, had she not gone, it would have been completely unethical. Had she not gone, I mean, at least he deserved to know whose son he was. Even knowing fully well, she must have had the premonition. He's already, in the side of adharma. He was the part of the dushta chatushtaya, meaning the evil four. The Duryodhan, Dushasan, Karna, and Mama Shakuni. Yeah. So that is a given. So he was, because he's on the side of Adharma, he was going to lose in the battlefield. And so many factors, there are so many sharps he has. He goes already weakened without the kavach and the kundal, and forgetting his, lessons that which the Guru, Parshuram gave him. So there are so many, shortcomings the moment he goes into the battlefield. And final blow to his ability to be in the battlefield comes from his own mother. But so she would have done greater sin and become more unethical had she not. So her actions, we could say, it doesn't sort of see in our scriptures, there is no such thing as any killing or any sin without prayashchit. That's a given. Whether Ram killed Ravan or whether Pandavas killed, they all, even Kartikeya had to, for killing Tarkasur, had to do prayashchit. So it is not with impunity you go and kill. That is the sukshma of the dharma, right? So you have to sort of, and even Vishnu, when he went and tricked Vrinda, Jalandhar's wife, and he had to take the shaft. So gods get shaft; they are cursed, and they too have to face their curses. And Gandhari gave the shaft to even Krishna. So the ethical validity comes from, okay, what is it? If she had not done that, so her action, we could say, has a certain, at that moment, some amount of ethical validity. That doesn't excuse her for her past sins of abandonment, abandoning her son and not sort of revealing it early on. So that is how we wrestle with it. Because if you're just only talking about right and wrong, I'll give you another example. These are some of my subjects, interpretation. Draupadi, when she says, I shall not offer my Varmala to Karna, he's a Sutputra, mere Varmala Sutputra ke liye nahi, it's, so there is a dilemma here. A woman's choice to choose her own husband, but she also used the category of social hierarchies in order to reject his candidacy. Gitesh, how are we doing with time? I get carried away. So are we okay? How much time do we have? We are okay? Okay.
We're fine.
I'm sorry?
We're fine with the time.
Okay. So, so when my participants in my study, when they watch that little snippet about she rejecting or discrediting the candidacy, they wrestle with that problem. Oh, she was wrong. Well, he was insulted. They then they in the text itself. Even actually, the first signaling comes from Krishna himself. Krishna signals to Draupadi and say, reject him, because he wants. You can read it on a cosmic plane, that marriages are made in heaven, and Krishna is the one who's sanctioning this and signaling to Draupadi, please reject his candidacy, right? That is a cosmic plane. But there is the other thing about social evaluations. Is it right or wrong? You could sort of say, well, if you take the next level from metonymy, you could say that, I'm sorry, metaphor, metonymy. There you could say that she is the upper caste, or she's a princess, and therefore there is a sort of a power relations, and she doesn't want to go beneath her status, and marry. But the next point is, the Pandavas are in a disguise. So how did she agree to marry, offer her garland to Arjun? So people go back and forth in wrestling with this. At first, they will sort of affirmatively say, "Oh God, Draupadi was really mean. She was a spoiled princess or whatever." In rejecting, and she invokes caste and rejects Karna and so on. And then they pick up a dialogue. Karna's Mama Shakuni says, Hastinapur's izzat is at stake, and so Karna says, when I'm here, Hastinapur's honor can never ever be in question. And so then says, okay, he's really not interested in Draupadi, but he's interested in saving the honor of Hastinapur. And so they find a certain justification, and then they will bring in their life. I don't know what to say. Sometimes, is there a polite way of rejecting a person who is, trying to win your heart? Sometimes it could be money. Sometimes it could be he has a crooked nose. There are many ways in which we people reject, and there is no easy way and then they will bring in, this is my participants were in America. You know what? I too am guilty of doing such things, rejecting somebody's candidacy. If some guy is coming, non-Indian, comes and tries to ask me for a date, my answer or an escape, if I'm not attracted to him, I'll just say, oh, my dad wants me to marry only an Indian, so that will be a kind of a closure. So then when you ask, okay, was that right? Then they will say, you know what, I think Draupadi needs to have some sleepless nights because she did insult him. So the way they come up with these, so they bring in that self, right, that lived experience of having the complexities of choosing a partner and then entering into that picture. And so life of the text, the actual dialogue. So you're reading it on many places. Krishna is the one who's sort of orchestrating, but still there is the agency, because in Mahābhārata, we are provided with the agency. We are making the choices, and whatever choice you make, and then they'll say, even like any other rejected person, Karna also has to accept the rejection from Draupadi. Humiliations are, she's not a trophy to be, just because you display your skill doesn't mean that you can just, make claims to that trophy. It has little, the same way, again, people would say, when you advertise for a job, you say these are the qualifications that we need. But when the actual interview takes place, many other factors play into the picture. So that is how the present day conditions and the plot in the epic kind of get into the into a dialogue. Similarly, I myself talk about quite a bit about motherhood in the Kunti, and the other scene is the Maya Mahal scene. There also initially that plot somehow it didn't generate that much sort of variations. Either the people would say, well, she was very unfeminine, and if she really felt like laughing when he falls into the puddle, she could have run into her inner chambers and covered her mouth with a pallu and then laughed inside. Instead, she laughs straight on his, in his face. So some would say, well, this is very uncouth, or not very feminine. That's where the gender issue comes in. But he was cautioned. So there are many levels. If you are going to be tricked with illusions, well, you become the laughing stock of the world. Right? That's just simply the reality. When somebody is cautioning you, don't go there, there is water there, he just simply dismisses the servant's cautionary words, and he goes and falls deep into the water. and she laughs at him. So in one of the cases, my two subjects were arguing about this. One guy was saying, oh, she's so crass and this was so horrible, and the text seems to suggest that she has no manners. She could have offered him a towel or something to wipe, or you know, like a good woman. And the other, his partner in the dialogue. So I set up people, you know, two people watch the plot and then they, you know, argue about it. So the other guy said, you know what, I don't see where the charity is coming from. If you were insulted and humiliated and, you know, about your earning capacity or anything, and then if you go build a house in a very, you know, pricey neighborhood, so, where you spend a lot of money and bring in Italian marbles and this and that, you would flaunt your home, you know. And then he said, you know, the moment Duryodhan fell into that puddle, you laughed. You yourself laughed, but you don't seem to be forgiving of Draupadi. And so this guy's answer was, it's immaterial whether I laugh. You know, he did not want to enter the text. He did not bring in his self and his life into that interpretive processes. And so to him, was just like going to a museum, you know, by checking the authenticity of the, you know, artifacts over there. And he did not have any, so to him, he says, that's what the text seems to say. And I don't know who wrote this text. On one hand, Indian culture, see, because they're faced with that contradiction. On one hand, you know, Indian culture says women, nari ki. And when in the next plot, when there is the Vastraharan, and she says nari ki maryada, they said, well, you didn't act so feminine for you to invoke that, you know. The next plot about the Vastraharan scene, that is where you really wrestle with so much. On one hand, Draupadi is raising question to the kingdom, to the empire, to the kingdom. The question is legal. Her question is legal. It is only later on she gets to the husband. So perhaps in the whole history of human race, in such an ancient text, she was the first one to question, what is a wife to a husband? Am I a possession? If I am a possession, right, of the husband, I'm lost along with him. If I'm not a possession, I was not in the pavilion where the game was going on, then how do we, you know, what is the validity of this transaction? Right? See, this has so many layers of Dharam Sankat, you know, the Vastraharan scene. People will blame Bhishma Pitama. He tried to avert the game, but he was stuck with a different problem. When somebody legally, rather, right, you know, legally, you cannot prevent the game anticipating fraud. You can't do that. So you have to allow the game. Perhaps they didn't think that it would escalate to this horror where she is dragged to the, you know, to the pavilion and an attempt is made to disrobe her. Many women, when that disrobing takes place, they you know, it's emotionally so heightened. And then they'll say, come on, yeah, you know, Krishna doesn't come to everyone. That's true. You know, every sexual assault, Krishna is not showing up to rescue. It's good that she had a pact. So you have to understand this on a different plane, on a social plane, as to that feeling of that violation. You have to bring Draupadi on many levels. Okay, she was rescued, or at least her honor was maintained because Krishna does this wonderful miracle, but they're also bringing it to the social level, right? And then saying Krishna doesn't show up. And then again go back and say, you know, actually she was fighting her own battle. You know, she was trying to invoke the strength. It's not literal that Krishna saved, but the divine energy, that's Shakti, or even if you say she is an Amsha of Durga or Kali, that's why she is very bloodthirsty. And therefore, she is invoking that strength, right, in order to sort of talk about women, Nari ki Maryada, and so on. So you are going back and forth on many levels. When you do that, then you can understand irony. When she stands in front of Bhishma Pitama and says, what is the justice? You are the patriarch, grand patriarch of the family. What do you have to say about it? And Bhishma Pitama cannot answer that question. He himself is guilty of bringing by force Amba, Ambika and Ambalika. And Amba eventually takes it. So then you arrive at a greater kind of an awareness. Sometimes we seek justice from people who themselves are guilty of the very same crime. So how do we sort of, so you are not letting, see, in the ethical validity, you're not letting anybody go scot-free, nor are you completely, because it depends on the degree of that crime, right? How far you go. Are there other qualities in them that sort of, it doesn't offset anything. No matter how small your sin is, you have to pay a price, and Bhishma Pitama paid the price. So whether it is Bhagavan Vishnu who disguises himself and goes and he does the bhang of the Pativrata bhang of Vrinda, or whether it is no one, no god or no warrior, no person goes scot-free. We are accountable. We have been endowed with agency. And when that agency is given to us, then you have to lead that ethical. So Dharma is not something that is absolute. The world is, so Mahābhārata teaches us that the world is not fair. It is adharmic. It is plain and simple adharmic. But amidst that adharmic, there is also a way we can, subscribe to dharma. It's not so much, the world is fair and the life is fair and the world is just. So once you're thrown into the battlefield, so ancient texts always saw our very existence as being thrown into the battlefield, Yuddharang. They're all thrown into the Yuddharang. What is the ammunition that you have, right? The ammunition is not just simply to annihilate the other or yourself, but you have to sort of engage in this and to see, so you pay the price, but you also get your glory by leading the dharmic life. So we cannot, I think a student said she was working on the Shanti Parva, which is good. But you cannot have peace without upholding dharma. Dharma is a precondition. It is not this sort of an artificial truth. But nowhere in Mahābhārata we say there is an artificial truth. That concept doesn't even exist. That is only superficial. As Sri Aurobindo would say, we need to get, you cannot talk about even diversity and other things that Aurobindo says without talking about the incredible variations. There are variations, there are incredible, and whether it is the ethic of loyalty, even that can be questioned, or taking a pratigna like Bhishma Pitama. These are all questionable, right? Why did he take that pratigna? Or why did, but interestingly, Karna doesn't give up or he does not honor. He has given up everything to everyone. But when his mother comes and says, he says no. So that is the only moment in Karna's life he doesn't, switch camps, because the ethic of loyalty is so ingrained and he lives by that. So that is the manodharma, right? So there are so many categories of dharma, right? There are so many variations, multiple. And how are we doing with time? Are we?
Can you sum up in 5 minutes so that we can go for the discussion?
Sure. No, because I think a dialogue would be better than because this is an what shall I call it? Open-ended text. So So what I'm saying is, when we approach the question of interpretation as a semiotic system where self-characterization, right? How do I draw the profile of myself, and how do I draw the characterological profiles of the characters? There is a sort of that's the other part of my book. Characterization, individual memory, collective memory, and the synchronic and diachronic life of the text converge. Then the semiosphere offers some valuable insights into the mental processes and cultural systems facing the forces of history. So we cannot ignore the forces of history and the forces of competing viewpoints. It does not necessarily say everything about mental operations, but allows us to hear the voices of mind to tell us how and why the individual psyche resorts to certain tactics in the interpretive stance. So when we look into the realm of the culture in the sphere, again, it does not necessarily explain all the cultural phenomena, but at best allows us to understand and explain how and why the culture has produced some of these phenomena. So it cannot be static, it cannot be. So it is precisely the inseparability of self and culture that demands that we locate the text within the individual to understand the ever emerging cognitive psychological sort of operations. So my work is an attempt to address the question of interpretation at the intersection of individuals' history of understanding and their understanding of history, where real people living in real cultures in real time make sense of the epic text, which has always been and will continue to be an emblem of great time, Mahākal. So that's where I like to kind of